The telegram slipped from Delia Porter's trembling fingers as she stood on the bustling train platform in Boston, Massachusetts. At 22 years old, she was about to leave behind everything she'd ever known to marry a man she'd never met, a cowboy who owned a cattle ranch in Palisade, Colorado. The year was 1875, and she had just received word that her intended husband was waiting for her, as promised. Last call for the westbound train, the conductor shouted, jolting Delia from her thoughts. She clutched her small carpet bag, which contained all of her worldly possessions, and took a deep breath. Born and raised in a strict religious household, Delia had lived a sheltered life. She had never been courted, never danced with a man, and certainly never been kissed. Her parents had passed away the previous winter from influenza, leaving her with no choice but to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride or face destitution. As the train whistle pierced the air, Delia whispered a prayer. "Lord, give me strength." With one final look at the city she was leaving behind, she boarded the train that would take her to a new life and a stranger who would become her husband. The journey west was long and arduous. 5 days of watching the landscape transform from the lush green of the east to the rugged terrain of the frontier. Delia spent much of the time reading and rereading the letters from her soon-to-be husband, Jacob Russell. His words were kind and straightforward, speaking of his cattle ranch, his modest home, and his hopes for a wife who would be a true partner. There were no flowery declarations of love, how could there be when they were strangers? But his letters conveyed a decency that gave Delia hope. As the train pulled into Denver, Delia's stomach tightened with anxiety. From here, she would take a stage coach to Palisade, where Jacob had promised to meet her. She wondered what he would look like. Would he be tall or short, kind-faced or stern? The few details she knew came from his letters. He was 30 years old, had established his ranch 8 years prior, and was, in his words, ready to share my life with a good woman. The stage-coach journey was even more uncomfortable than the train, with the constant jostling over rutted roads and the dust that seemed to find its way into every fold of clothing. By the time they approached Palisade, Delia was exhausted, her blue traveling dress wrinkled, and her bonnet askew. "Palisade ahead," called the driver. Delia peered out the small window. The town was smaller than she'd imagined, a collection of wooden buildings stretching down a main street, with mountains rising majestically in the distance. As the stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the general store, she saw a small gathering of people waiting. Her heart raced as she stepped down, scanning the faces of the men, wondering which one was Jacob Russell. Then a tall figure stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal thick brown hair with touches of sun-bleached gold. "Miss Porter." His voice was deep and steady. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Russell," he nodded, his blue eyes studying her face. "Welcome to Palisade." Jacob Russell was not what Delia had expected. She had imagined someone older, perhaps weathered and rough around the edges. Instead, he stood before her tall and strong, with a clean-shaven face and eyes that seemed to hold both kindness and caution. He wore a simple button-up shirt, a vest, worn denims, and boots that had seen many miles. "I hope your journey wasn't too difficult," he said, maintaining a respectful distance. "It was long, but I managed," Delia replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, smiling warmly. "I'm Martha Wilson, dear. My husband Tom and I run the general store. Jacob asked if we'd put you up for a few days until you decide if you want to go through with the marriage." Delia blinked in surprise, glancing at Jacob. "I know we've corresponded," he said, "but seeing someone in letters isn't the same as meeting in person. I thought you might want some time to be sure before we visit the preacher." Relief flooded through her. She hadn't expected such consideration. "That's very thoughtful of you, Mr. Russell." "Jacob, please," he said with a slight smile that transformed his serious face. "Jacob," she repeated, finding the name felt right on her lips. After helping with her luggage, Jacob tipped his hat. "I'll call on you tomorrow if that's agreeable. You must be tired from your journey." "Yes, thank you. Tomorrow would be fine." As he walked away, Delia watched his tall figure, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. He seemed kind and considerate, but they were still strangers. Martha led her to a small but tidy room above the general store. "Jacob Russell is one of the good ones," she said as she showed Delia where to hang her dresses. "Been here since '67. Worked for the Millers until he saved enough to buy his own place. Never seen him lose his temper even when he had every right to." "Has he? Was there someone before me?" Delia asked hesitantly. Martha shook her head. "No, dear. He's been alone all these years, focused on building his ranch. It's only in the last year that he started talking about finding a wife." She patted Delia's hand. "Rest now. Things will look brighter in the morning." Alone in her room, Delia unpacked her few belongings, including a small Bible that had belonged to her mother. She sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. She was thousands of miles from home, about to marry a man she'd just met. What if he changed once they were married? What if he expected things she wasn't ready to give? Delia had never been kissed. The thought of physical intimacy terrified her. Her mother had told her little about what happened between a husband and wife, only that it was her duty to submit. She lay down on the unfamiliar bed, tears sliding silently down her cheeks until sleep finally claimed her. Morning came with the sounds of a town awakening. Delia dressed in her best day dress, a modest blue cotton with a lace collar, and pinned her chestnut hair in a simple style. She was just helping Martha arrange some new fabric bolts when Jacob arrived. "Good morning," he said, hat in hand. "I thought I might show you around Palisade if you're feeling up to it." "I'd like that," Delia replied. The town was small but busy. Jacob introduced her to the blacksmith, the doctor, the sheriff, and several ranchers and their wives who had come to town for supplies. Everyone seemed curious about her, but kind. "Most folks here came from somewhere else," Jacob explained as they walked. "Everyone understands starting over." They stopped for lunch at a small cafe run by a Chinese couple who had come west during the gold rush. The food was unlike anything Delia had tasted before, but she found she enjoyed it. "Tell me about your ranch," she said as they ate. Jacob's eyes lit up. "It's not the biggest spread, but it's good land. I run about 100 head of cattle, have some chickens, a vegetable garden. The house isn't fancy, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a sitting room, but it's solid. I built it myself." "It sounds lovely," Delia said sincerely. "It's lonely," he admitted, then looked embarrassed. "I mean, it's peaceful, but—" "I understand," she said softly. After lunch, they walked to the edge of town where the view opened up to reveal rolling hills and the distant mountains. "My place is about 3 miles that way," Jacob said, pointing. "Would you like to see it tomorrow? Martha could come along as chaperone." Delia nodded. "I'd like that very much." The next day, Jacob arrived with a wagon to take Delia and Martha to his ranch. As they left town behind, the landscape opened up, wild and beautiful. Delia had never seen such vast open spaces. "There it is," Jacob said eventually, pointing to a homestead nestled against a backdrop of pine trees. The house was exactly as he described, modest but sturdy, with smoke curling from the chimney. A barn stood nearby, along with a corral where several horses grazed. In the distance, cattle dotted the hillsides. "It's beautiful," Delia said honestly. Jacob's expression softened. "I'm glad you think so." He showed her around, clearly proud of what he'd built. The inside of the house was simple but clean, with handmade furniture and a few touches that spoke of care curtains on the windows, a rag rug by the fireplace, books on a small shelf. "I know it's not what you're used to," he said, suddenly seeming unsure. "It's a real home," Delia replied. "You should be proud." That evening, as they returned to town, Jacob asked the question Delia had been expecting. "Miss Porter, Delia, I know we've only just met, but I meant what I wrote in my letters. I'm looking for a partner, someone to share this life with. I won't rush you, but I need to know if you think you could be happy here with me." Delia looked at his earnest face. There was no denying he was handsome, and everything she'd seen suggested he was a good, hard-working man. But marriage was forever, and she barely knew him. "May I have a few more days to be certain?" she asked. He nodded, looking relieved rather than disappointed. "Of course. Take all the time you need." Over the next week, Delia spent more time with Jacob, learning about his daily life and sharing stories of her own upbringing. She discovered he had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was comfortable, and that he was respected by everyone in town. He didn't drink to excess or gamble, and he treated everyone, including the Chinese cafe owners and the Mexican ranch hands, with equal respect. She also spoke with several of the women in town, including the pastor's wife, who all spoke highly of Jacob. "You won't find a better man," the blacksmith's wife told her. "If my Emily wasn't already happily married, I'd have set my cap for him myself." By the end of the week, Delia had made her decision. She found Jacob at the livery stable where he was discussing horseshoes with the blacksmith. "May I speak with you?" she asked. They walked to a bench outside the general store, sitting a respectable distance apart. "I've given it a lot of thought," Delia began, her heart pounding. "And if you're still willing, I would be honored to be your wife." The smile that spread across Jacob's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Nothing would make me happier," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll speak to Reverend Clark today." They were married 3 days later in the small white church at the end of Main Street. Delia wore her best dress, a cream-colored cotton with pearl buttons that had been her mother's, and Martha had helped her fashion a wreath of wildflowers for her hair. Jacob wore a new shirt and his cleanest denims, his hair slicked back with water. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. Delia's hands trembled as Jacob placed a plain gold band on her finger, a ring he'd ordered from Denver, he explained, hoping she would say yes. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Clark announced at the end. Delia froze. This was the moment she'd been dreading. She had never been kissed before, had no idea what to expect. Jacob must have sensed her fear, for he simply leaned forward and pressed his lips gently against her forehead. "We have time," he whispered for her ears only. Relief and gratitude washed over her. They celebrated with a small reception at the general store, where the townspeople had brought food and small gifts to welcome Delia. As the sun began to set, Jacob helped her into the wagon for the journey to what was now their home. The first weeks of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Delia took over the running of the household, learning to cook on a wood stove and manage with fewer conveniences than she'd had in Boston. Jacob showed her how to tend the chickens and the vegetable garden, and introduced her to the 2 ranch hands who helped with the cattle, Miguel and his teenage son, Louis. At night, true to his word, Jacob didn't pressure her. He had given her the main bedroom while he slept in the smaller second room that he'd been using as an office. Every night, he would kiss her hand or her forehead before retiring, never asking for more. One evening, about 3 weeks after the wedding, Delia was preparing dinner when Jacob came in from a long day of mending fences. "Something smells good," he said, washing up at the basin by the door. "Just a stew," Delia replied, feeling pleased nonetheless. She was getting better at cooking with what was available. They ate together, as they did every evening, talking about their day. Jacob told her about a mother wolf he'd spotted with cubs, and Delia shared that she'd successfully made bread that hadn't turned out like a brick. After dinner, as they sat by the fireplace, Delia found the courage to broach the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Jacob," she began, her voice small, "I know I'm not being a proper wife to you." He looked up from his book, brow furrowed. "What do you mean, we don't?" "That is, I haven't." She couldn't find the words. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Delia, I told you we have time." "But it's been weeks," she said, tears of frustration pricking at her eyes. "You must be disappointed." Jacob set his book aside and moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "Listen to me. I didn't bring you out here just to have a woman in my bed. I wanted a partner, a friend. We're building that, and I'm not disappointed at all. But don't you want?" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Of course I do," he said honestly, "but only when you're ready, not a moment before. I can wait." "What if I'm never ready?" The fear that had been haunting her finally surfaced. His smile was gentle. "Then we'll have a marriage based on friendship and respect, and that would still be more than many people have." Delia was stunned by his words. In Boston, she'd been raised to believe a woman's primary duty was to provide children and comfort to her husband. The idea that he valued her companionship above all else was revolutionary. "Thank you," she whispered, squeezing his hands. That night, when Jacob kissed her forehead before retiring to his room, Delia felt something shift inside her. It wasn't desire, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of something deeper: trust. Summer turned to autumn, bringing with it changes in the landscape and in their relationship. Delia grew more confident in her role as a rancher's wife. She learned to ride a gentle mare Jacob had trained for her, and sometimes accompanied him and the hands when they moved the cattle to different pastures. Their evenings together grew longer as the days shortened. They read to each other by lamplight, played cards, and talked about everything from politics to childhood memories. Delia discovered that Jacob had lost his parents young and been raised by an uncle who was kind but distant. He'd come west at 18, drawn by the promise of land and opportunity, and never looked back. In turn, she shared stories of her life in Boston, her strict upbringing, and her dreams of one day having a family of her own. It was during one of these conversations that she found the courage to ask something that had been on her mind. "Jacob, why did you decide to send for a mail-order bride? A man like you could have courted any of the young women in the area." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "There aren't many unmarried women of a suitable age around here," he said. "But more than that, I wanted someone who wasn't already part of this community, someone who might bring new perspectives." He smiled wryly. "And I'm not particularly good at courting." "The formality of letters suited me better." Delia laughed at his honesty. "Well, your letters worked. Here I am." "Here you are," he agreed, his eyes warm as they rested on her face, "and I'm grateful for it every day." As October arrived, bringing the first frosts, Delia realized something important: she was falling in love with her husband. It wasn't the passionate love described in novels, but something steadier and deeper. She loved his integrity, his quiet strength, the way he hummed while he worked, the crinkles around his eyes when he smiled. One crisp morning, Delia woke early and found Jacob already out in the barn. She dressed quickly and went to join him, enjoying the way her breath misted in the cold air. "Good morning," she called as she entered the barn. Jacob looked up from where he was examining a cow's hoof. "Morning, you're up early." "I thought I might help with the chores before breakfast." He smiled appreciatively. "I'm almost done here, but you could check on the new calf." He's in the last stall. Delia made her way to the stall, where a week-old calf was curled up in the straw. The little bull calf had been born early and weak, and Jacob had been tending to him round the clock. To her delight, the calf struggled to his feet when she approached, stronger than the day before. "Jacob, look, he's standing on his own." Jacob joined her at the stall, his face lighting up at the sight. "Well, would you look at that?" he said proudly, reaching over to scratch the calf's ears. "Good job, little fella." Without thinking, Delia threw her arms around Jacob's waist in an impulsive hug. It was the first time she had initiated any physical contact between them. For a moment, he stiffened in surprise, then his arms came around her, holding her gently. "Sorry," she mumbled, starting to pull away. "Don't be," he said, keeping one arm lightly around her shoulders. "I like it when you're happy." They stood like that for a moment, the warmth of his body comforting in the chilly barn. Then the calf let out a demanding bleat, breaking the spell. Jacob laughed. "Demanding little thing, isn't he? I'd better get him his bottle." As they walked back to the house together after completing the morning chores, Delia felt a new sense of contentment. The physical barrier between them was beginning to crumble, slowly but surely. That evening, after dinner, a sudden squall blew in, bringing with it driving rain that pounded against the roof and windows. Jacob stoked the fire higher to ward off the chill. "Might be our first real storm of the season," he said, returning to his chair. Delia shivered despite the fire's warmth. "It sounds fierce. The house is solid, will be dry and warm." A particularly loud thunderclap shook the house, making Delia jump. Jacob looked at her with concern. "Are you afraid of storms?" "A little," she admitted. "They always make me feel small and vulnerable." Without a word, Jacob rose and moved his chair closer to hers, offering silent companionship. Delia gave him a grateful smile. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Then Jacob spoke, his voice thoughtful. "My mother used to say that storms remind us that nature is bigger than we are, but that's why we build homes and communities to face that vastness together." "She sounds wise," Delia said softly. "She was. I was only 10 when she died, but I remember her clearly." His face grew distant with memory. "She had a garden like your building, and she used to sing while she worked." Delia realized this was the most he'd ever shared about his mother. "What happened to her?" "Fever took her and my father both, within a week of each other." His voice was matter-of-fact, but she could hear the old pain beneath it. Instinctively, Delia reached over and took his hand. "I'm sorry." He squeezed her fingers gently. "It was a long time ago." Another crash of thunder, closer this time, and the lamp flickered ominously. Jacob got up to trim the wick, ensuring it wouldn't go out if the wind grew stronger. "Perhaps we should retire early," he suggested. "If the storm gets worse, we might need to check on the livestock during the night." Delia nodded and stood, gathering her sewing basket. As she passed Jacob on her way to her bedroom, she paused. Then, summoning her courage, she stood on tiptoe and pressed a quick, soft kiss to his cheek. "Good night," she whispered, then hurried to her room before she could see his reaction. Inside, with the door closed, she leaned against it, heart pounding. It wasn't much, just a kiss on the cheek, but it was the first time she had kissed him. Progress, she thought, small but significant. The storm continued through the night, and Delia found sleep elusive. Around midnight, she heard Jacob moving about, then the front door opening and closing as he went to check on the animals. She lit a lamp and wrapped a shawl around her nightgown, then went to the kitchen to prepare hot coffee for when he returned. Jacob came back 30 minutes later, soaked to the skin despite his oilskin coat. "Everything all right?" Delia asked, pouring him coffee. He nodded, removing his dripping hat and coat. "Just a few loose shutters on the barn. Wanted to make sure the roof was holding." He accepted the coffee gratefully. You didn't need to wait up. I couldn't sleep anyway. She noticed he was shivering. You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death, he grinned. Yes, madam. While he changed, Delia added wood to the fire in the main room. When Jacob returned in dry clothes, his hair still damp, she had a blanket ready for him. Sit, she instructed, pointing to the chair nearest the fire. He obeyed, amusement playing around his mouth. You're quite commanding when you want to be, Mrs. Russell. The use of her married name still gave Delia a little thrill. Only when necessary, Mr. Russell. They sat together by the fire, listening to the storm gradually move away. There was something intimate about being awake together in the middle of the night, the rest of the world asleep or hidden behind the curtain of rain. Thank you, Jacob said after a while. For what? Waiting up, the coffee, caring. He looked at her directly, his eyes serious in the firelight. For the kiss earlier. Delia felt her cheeks warm. It was just a small thing. Not to me. His voice was quiet but certain. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken feelings. Delia looked down at her hands, unsure what to say next. Jacob broke the silence. We should try to get some sleep. Dawn will be here before we know it. As they stood to return to their separate rooms, Delia found herself reluctant to end the moment. Jacob, he turned, eyebrows raised in question. I'm glad I came here. I'm glad I married you. The smile that spread across his face was worth any embarrassment her confession might have caused. So am I, Delia. More than I can say. As November settled in, bringing shorter days and the first light snowfall, life at the ranch took on a different rhythm. There was less outdoor work with the cattle now that they had been moved to the lower pastures for winter, but more preparation needed for the cold months ahead. Jacob spent days chopping and stacking firewood, while Delia preserved the last of the garden's bounty and organized their stores. Their evenings grew longer and more companionable. Sometimes Miguel and his son would join them for dinner, filling the house with laughter and conversation in a mix of English and Spanish. Other nights, it was just the two of them, reading or talking, or sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. Physical affection between them increased gradually. A touch on the arm when passing, a hand at the small of her back as he guided her through a door, a brief embrace at the end of the day. Delia found herself looking forward to these moments of contact, no longer anxious but curious and increasingly warm. One evening, as the first serious snowstorm of the season blanketed the ranch in white, they sat closer than usual by the fire. Delia was reading aloud from a novel Jacob had ordered from Denver as a surprise for her, while he whittled a small wooden figure, a hobby she hadn't known about until recently. The heart has its reasons which reason knows nothing of, she read, then paused. That's rather beautiful, isn't it? Jacob looked up from his carving. Pascal, I believe, and yes, it is. Do you think it's true, she asked, marking her place in the book, that the heart and the mind operate by different rules? He considered the question seriously. Yes, I do. The mind can make all the logical arguments it wants, but the heart follows its own path. Is that why you waited so patiently for me? The question slipped out before she could consider it. Jacob set down his whittling knife. Partly, he admitted. But also because anything worth having is worth waiting for. His eyes met hers, steady and warm. And you, Delia Russell, are definitely worth waiting for. Something shifted in the air between them, a tension that wasn't uncomfortable but expectant. Delia's heart began to beat faster. Jacob, she said softly, I think I might be ready now. He set aside his carving and moved to kneel before her chair, much as he had that night months ago. Ready for what exactly, he asked, his voice gentle, to be a proper wife to you in every way. Despite her resolve, her cheeks flamed with the admission. Jacob took her hands in his. "Are you sure? Because I meant what I said. I can keep waiting." Delia nodded. "I'm sure. I trust you, Jacob, and I care for you deeply." He smiled, a slow, warm smile that reached his eyes. "I care for you too, more than I ever thought possible." Slowly, giving her every chance to back away, he leaned forward. When his lips finally met hers, the kiss was gentle, questioning. Delia's eyes fluttered closed as she experienced her first real kiss at the age of 22. It was nothing like she had feared. His lips were warm and soft against hers, the pressure light and undemanding. When he pulled back, she was surprised to find herself leaning forward, chasing the contact. Jacob chuckled softly. "All right." "Yes," she whispered. "Very all right." He kissed her again, a little deeper this time, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. Delia felt a warmth spreading through her body, a pleasant tingling that was entirely new. When they separated, both were breathing a little faster. "We should probably stop there for tonight," Jacob said, his voice husky. "Take things slow." Delia nodded, though part of her was disappointed. "Of course." He must have seen it in her face, for he laughed softly and pressed another quick kiss to her lips. "Believe me, it's not for lack of wanting, but I want to do this right." That night, Delia lay awake in her bed, replaying the kisses in her mind. Her lips still seemed to tingle with the memory. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to share a bed with Jacob, to feel his arms around her through the night. The thought was no longer frightening but intriguing. Over the next few days, their physical relationship continued to develop gradually. Kisses became a regular part of their daily life. Good morning kisses, goodbye kisses when Jacob went out to work, hello kisses when he returned, good night kisses that grew increasingly lingering. A week after their first kiss, during a particularly cold evening, they sat together on the small sofa rather than in separate chairs. Jacob's arm was around her shoulders, and Delia's head rested comfortably against him as he read aloud from the newspaper that had arrived on the weekly mail coach. "Apparently, they're making progress on that transcontinental railroad spur that will connect Denver to Salt Lake City," he was saying. Delia made a noise of acknowledgement, but her mind was elsewhere. She was acutely aware of the warmth of his body beside hers, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the clean scent of soap and pine that always seemed to surround him. When he finished reading, he set the paper aside and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Penny, for your thoughts." Delia took a deep breath. "I was thinking that perhaps tonight I might move my things into your room." Jacob went very still. "Are you certain?" She looked up at him, meeting his eyes directly. "Yes, I'm certain." He searched her face for a moment, then nodded. "All right." They moved her clothing and personal items together, the ordinary domestic task somehow charged with significance. When everything was arranged to her satisfaction, Delia found herself standing awkwardly in the middle of what was now their shared bedroom, unsure what to do next. Jacob sensed her uncertainty. "How about we finish our evening as usual, and when it's time for bed, we'll just see how things go?" Relieved, Delia agreed. They returned to the main room, resuming their positions on the sofa. Jacob picked up his whittling again while Delia worked on mending one of his shirts. The ordinary activities helped calm her nerves, and by the time the clock struck 9, she felt more settled. "Ready for bed?" Jacob asked, setting aside his project. Delia nodded, and they went through their usual evening routine, banking the fire, checking that the doors were secure, blowing out the lamps. The only difference was that they both entered the same bedroom at the end. Jacob turned his back politely while Delia changed into her nightgown behind a screen, then he quickly changed into his own nightclothes. When they finally faced each other, both in their nightwear, there was a moment of shyness. I can sleep on top of the covers if you'd prefer, Jacob offered. Delia shook her head. That's not necessary, it's too cold for that. They climbed into bed from opposite sides, the mattress dipping as they settled. For a moment they lay stiffly side by side, not touching. Then Jacob reached out and took her hand. "We don't have to do anything tonight," he said softly. "Just sleeping together is enough." The knot of tension in Delia's chest loosened. "Could you hold me?" she asked. Jacob's smile was visible even in the dim light. "Nothing would make me happier." He opened his arms and Delia moved into them, her back against his chest, his arm draped over her waist. It felt strange at first, but then wonderfully right. "Good night, Delia," he murmured against her hair. "Good night, Jacob." She fell asleep faster than she'd expected, lulled by the steady rhythm of his breathing and the security of his embrace. Delia woke the next morning to find Jacob already awake, watching her with a tender expression. "Good morning," he said softly. "Morning," she replied, suddenly shy again in the light of day. "Sleep well," she nodded. "Better than I have in a long time." His smile was like the sunrise. "Me too." Over the next few weeks, as winter fully settled in, Delia and Jacob grew more comfortable with physical intimacy. Each step was taken slowly, with Jacob always checking that she was comfortable, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. And gradually, Delia found herself wanting more curious about the pleasures she had been taught to fear, eager to discover the fullness of love with the man who had won her heart. By Christmas, their marriage was complete in every sense. The physical expression of their love turned out to be as beautiful and natural as the emotional bond they had built. And Delia wondered why she had ever been afraid. Christmas at the ranch was a joyful affair. Jacob surprised Delia with a beautiful leather-bound journal and a set of watercolor paints, remembering her mention of enjoying art as a girl. She had knitted him a warm scarf and secretly commissioned a new saddle from the leather worker in town. "I have one more gift for you," Jacob said as they sat before the fire after Christmas dinner. "It's not much, but—" He handed her a small wooden figure, a perfect miniature of her mare, detailed down to the distinctive white marking on its forehead. "You made this?" Delia gasped, turning the carving in her hands. "Been working on it for weeks," he admitted. "Had to hide it whenever you came around. It's beautiful." She leaned over to kiss him. "Thank you." Later, as they lay together in their bed, Delia reflected on how far they had come in 6 months. From strangers bound by a contract to true partners in every sense. "What are you thinking about?" Jacob asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "How different things are from what I expected," she replied honestly. "When I left Boston, I was terrified. I didn't know if I could be a proper wife, especially." She hesitated, then continued, "especially in the physical sense. I'd never even been kissed. And now—" His voice was curious, not judgmental. Delia smiled in the darkness. "Now I can't imagine my life any other way with any other man." He pulled her closer. "I knew from your first letter that you were special, Delia Porter Russell, but the reality of you is better than anything I could have imagined. Even though you had to wait months for me to be ready," she teased. "I would have waited years," he said simply. "You're worth it." As winter gave way to spring, Delia found herself experiencing occasional bouts of nausea in the mornings. At first, she dismissed it as a mild illness, but when the pattern continued for 2 weeks, she began to suspect the truth. She confided her suspicion to Martha Wilson during a trip to town for supplies. The older woman smiled knowingly. "When was your last monthly time, dear?" When Delia calculated the dates, she realized it had been nearly 2 months. "I'd say congratulations are in order," Martha said, squeezing her hand. "Have you told Jacob yet?" "No," Delia admitted. "I wanted to be sure." Well, in my experience, these things are rarely wrong. You're carrying a little Russell, I'd wager. The idea filled Delia with a mixture of joy and apprehension. A baby Jacob's baby growing inside her. It seemed miraculous. That evening after dinner, Delia took Jacob's hand and led him to the porch swing he had built the previous summer. The evening was mild, with the scent of blooming wildflowers carried on the breeze. "I have something to tell you," she said, her heart racing with excitement. Jacob looked at her expectantly. "What is it?" "I think, I'm quite sure actually, that we're going to have a baby." For a moment he seemed frozen, his expression unreadable. Then his face transformed with a joy so pure it took her breath away. "A baby? Really?" When she nodded, he let out a whoop that probably startled the cattle in the far pasture. Then he was on his knees before her, hands gently cradling her still flat stomach. "When?" "I think sometime in November, based on what Martha told me." "November," he repeated, awe in his voice. "A year after our first kiss." Delia hadn't made the connection, but now it seemed wonderfully fitting. "Yes, I suppose it is." Jacob looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For answering my advertisement, for taking a chance on a stranger, for coming west, for being patient with me while I was patient with you, for loving me, for carrying our child." He pressed a reverent kiss to her stomach. "For everything." Delia's own eyes filled with tears. "I should be thanking you. You gave me a home, a purpose, a love I never thought I'd find." She cupped his face in her hands. "You've made me so happy, Jacob Russell." "That goes both ways, Delia Russell." He rose to sit beside her again, pulling her close. "When I sent that advertisement, I was hoping for a practical arrangement, someone to share the work and maybe, eventually, some affection." He kissed her temple. "I never dreamed I'd find my heart's match." They sat together on the porch as twilight deepened into night, making plans for the baby, for the future, for their life together. Delia thought back to that day on the train platform in Boston, how terrified she had been to journey into the unknown. Now, she couldn't imagine any other path. The months of pregnancy passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Jacob built a cradle with his own hands, carving delicate patterns of leaves and animals into the wood. Delia sewed tiny garments and quilts, while the women of Palisade contributed their own gifts and advice. Jacob became even more protective, insisting on handling the heavier chores and watching Delia like a hawk for any sign of discomfort. She found his concern endearing rather than stifling, recognizing it as an expression of his love. As her body changed, their physical relationship adapted. Jacob was endlessly creative in finding ways to express his desire for her that accommodated her growing belly and changing needs. Far from feeling less attractive, Delia had never felt more beautiful than when she saw herself through her husband's adoring eyes. In late October, earlier than expected, Delia went into labor during a gentle autumn snowfall. Jacob rode for the doctor, returning with both Dr. Thompson and Martha Wilson, who had experience as a midwife. The labor was difficult and long. Through it all, Jacob refused to leave her side, holding her hand, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement even when his own face was tight with worry. After 18 hours, their son was born, a healthy, robust boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's blue eyes. They named him Thomas, after Jacob's father. "He's perfect," Jacob whispered, cradling the tiny bundle with hands that looked too large for such a delicate task. "He is," Delia agreed, exhausted but radiant with joy. The doctor and Martha discreetly left the new family alone, promising to return in the morning to check on mother and child. Jacob carefully placed Thomas in a bassinet beside their bed, then stretched out next to Delia, gathering her gently in his arms. How do you feel? Tired? Sore? Happier than I've ever been, she nestled against him. How about you? Like my heart might burst, he pressed a kiss to her forehead. I have a son and the most extraordinary wife. As they drifted toward sleep, interrupted periodically by the newborn's cries, Delia reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From a sheltered girl who had never been kissed to a wife, a mother, a woman who knew both passion and deep, abiding love. I love you, she murmured, already half asleep. And I love you, Jacob replied, his arms secure around her. More than I have words to say. 5 years passed, bringing changes both expected and surprising. The ranch prospered under Jacob's careful management, growing to include more land and cattle. Delia established herself as not just a rancher's wife, but a valued member of the Palisade community, serving on the school board and helping to establish a small lending library. Thomas grew into a lively, curious boy with his father's calm temperament and his mother's love of books. He was joined 2 years after his birth by a sister, Sarah, a determined little girl with chestnut curls like her mother's and a laugh that could charm birds from the trees. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Jacob surprised Delia with a trip to Denver, their first real vacation since their marriage. The children stayed with Martha and Tom Wilson, who had become honorary grandparents to the Russell children. In Denver, they marveled at the growing city, attended a theatrical performance, and enjoyed the luxury of a fine hotel. On their last evening, as they dressed for dinner at the hotel's elegant restaurant, Jacob presented Delia with a small velvet box. "What's this?" she asked, opening it to reveal a delicate gold locket. "Open it," he urged. Inside was a tiny portrait of their family, Jacob, Delia, Thomas, and Sarah, painted by a photographer in Denver from a tintype they had brought with them. "It's beautiful," Delia whispered, eyes filling with tears. Jacob fastened it around her neck. "Not as beautiful as the real thing, but this way you can always carry us with you." At dinner, over a glass of champagne, Jacob raised a toast. "To 5 years with the woman who brought light back into my life." Delia smiled, raising her own glass. "And to the man who waited patiently for a frightened girl to find her courage." Later, in the privacy of their hotel room, their lovemaking was as passionate as ever, deepened by years of intimacy and trust. Afterward, as they lay entwined, Delia traced the lines of Jacob's face with her fingertips. "You ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" she asked. "If you hadn't placed that advertisement or if I hadn't answered it?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I look at what we've built together and I can't imagine any other path." He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Do you regret it, coming west to marry a stranger?" "Not for a single moment," she replied honestly. "It was the best decision I ever made, and it was true." The journey from mail-order bride to beloved wife and mother had not always been easy, but it had been richly rewarding. The girl who had never been kissed had found not just physical passion, but a deep, abiding love with a man who had been willing to wait for her heart to catch up to her circumstances. As they drifted toward sleep, Delia's last thought was one of profound gratitude for Jacob's patience, for her own courage, and for the beautiful life they had created together on the Colorado frontier. 10 years after Delia stepped off the stagecoach in Palisade, the Russell family gathered on the porch of their home, which had been expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family and prosperity. Thomas, now 10, sat whittling a piece of wood, his hands already skilled like his father's. Sarah, 8, was reading a book, her brow furrowed in concentration. 5-year-old Matthew and 3-year-old Lily played with wooden blocks at their parents' feet. Jacob, his hair now threaded with silver at the temples, had his arm around Delia as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch had grown significantly. They now employed 4 full-time hands and ran over 300 head of cattle. The modest house Jacob had built with his own hands had been expanded into a comfortable home with 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a dedicated library filled with books that Delia ordered from as far away as New York and San Francisco. "It's hard to believe it's been 10 years, Delia mused, leaning her head against Jacob's shoulder. "The best 10 years of my life," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. As twilight deepened, they called the children inside for dinner. The evening routine was familiar and comforting: washing up, saying grace, sharing stories about their day. Thomas talked excitedly about the new colt that had been born that morning, while Sarah described the book she was reading. Matthew proudly announced that he had helped collect eggs without breaking any, and Lily, not to be outdone, declared that she had seen a fox in the far meadow. After the children were tucked into bed, Jacob and Delia sat together in the library, as they did most evenings. A fire crackled in the fireplace, warding off the autumn chill. "I had a letter from the railroad company today," Jacob said, reaching for his pipe. "They're interested in purchasing right-of-way through the southwest corner of our property for that new spur line." Delia looked up from her embroidery. "What did you tell them?" "That I'd consider their offer." He tamped tobacco into his pipe. "The money would be good and it wouldn't affect our grazing land much. Plus, having the railroad closer would make shipping cattle easier." "And bringing in books," Delia added with a smile. Jacob chuckled. "Always thinking about your books." "Not always," she said, setting aside her work and moving to sit beside him on the sofa. "Sometimes I think about other things." "Oh," he raised an eyebrow, his eyes twinkling. "Like what?" "Like how fortunate I am to have a husband who values my opinion on railroad deals," she said, leaning against him. "And who reads to the children every night, and who still looks at me the way you're looking at me right now." Jacob set down his pipe, turning to face her fully. "And how am I looking at you? Like I'm still the girl you waited months to kiss." His expression softened. "You're so much more than that girl now, Delia. You're the heart of this family, the center of my world." Delia felt a familiar warmth spread through her at his words. Even after a decade of marriage and 4 children, Jacob still had the ability to make her feel cherished and desired. "You remember our first real kiss?" she asked. "By the fire during that snowstorm." "I remember every detail," he replied. "How your hands trembled. How you tasted of tea and honey. How I had to force myself to stop before I scared you." Delia laughed softly. "And now," he said, drawing her closer, "I know exactly how much you can handle." His lips met hers in a kiss that held all the passion of their youth, combined with the deep understanding that only years together could bring. Later, as they lay together in their bed, Jacob propped himself up on one elbow, studying her face in the moonlight that filtered through the curtains. "What?" she asked, feeling self-conscious under his gaze. "Just thinking about how much my life has changed since you arrived," he said. "Remember how quiet this place was? Just me rattling around in that 2-room house, talking to the cattle because I had no one else. And now we can barely hear ourselves think sometimes," Delia laughed. "Especially when Matthew and Lily get going." "I wouldn't change a thing," Jacob said seriously. "Not one moment of it." Delia reached up to trace the lines at the corners of his eyes, lines she knew had deepened partly from squinting in the sun, but mostly from laughter. "Nor would I." And it was true. The path from mail-order bride to the woman she was now had not always been easy, but every step had been worthwhile. Jacob had given her the time and space to find her way to love, never pressuring, always supporting. In return, She had built a life with him that exceeded any dreams either of them had harbored. As they drifted toward sleep, Delia thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off that stage coach a decade ago, never having known a man's kiss or touch. That woman could never have imagined the richness of the life that awaited her, the passion, the children, the sense of purpose and belonging. She had come west seeking security and found love instead, a love that had grown deeper and stronger with each passing year. Jacob's breathing had slowed, indicating he was nearly asleep. Delia nestled closer, whispering the words that had become as natural as breathing, "I love you." His arm tightened around her, his voice drowsy but certain, "And I love you. Always have, always will." Outside, the moon cast silver light over the ranch they had built together, a testament to patience, courage, and the transformative power of love that grows in its own time, blooming all the more beautifully for having been nurtured with care and understanding. In the years that followed, Palisade grew from a small frontier settlement to a bustling town, with the railroad bringing new residents and opportunities. The Russell Ranch expanded further, becoming one of the most successful operations in the county. Thomas, now a young man of 20, worked alongside his father, learning every aspect of the business he would someday inherit. Sarah, at 18, had just been accepted to a women's college in Denver, the first girl from Palisade to pursue higher education. As Delia approached her 45th birthday, she found herself reflecting on the journey of her life. The shy, inexperienced girl who had arrived in Colorado as a mail-order bride had grown into a confident woman respected throughout the community. She had helped establish Palisade's first proper school and library, served on various town committees, and even written articles about frontier life for Eastern publications. Jacob, at 53, was still strong and vital, though his hair had turned completely silver. If anything, the years had only enhanced his appeal, adding character to his handsome features. He had served as mayor of Palisade for 2 terms and was known throughout the region for his fair dealing and integrity. Their relationship remained the foundation of their lives, a partnership of equals built on mutual respect, shared goals, and a love that had only deepened with time. The physical passion that had developed slowly in those early days had matured into an intimacy that encompassed body, mind, and spirit. On a warm summer evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the land that had been their home for nearly a quarter-century, Delia reached for Jacob's hand. "I was thinking today about that advertisement you placed," she said. "How different our lives would have been if you hadn't, or if I hadn't seen it." Jacob squeezed her fingers. "I've thanked Providence every day for guiding that newspaper into your hands." Delia smiled. "And I've thanked Providence for giving me the courage to respond, and for sending me a husband who understood that love sometimes needs time to grow." "The waiting was worth every moment," Jacob said, his eyes warm with memory. "And every day since has been a gift." As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, surrounded by the sounds of the ranch settling for the evening, distant lowing of cattle, the soft nickering of horses in the barn, the familiar creaking of the house that had sheltered their family through years of joy and occasional sorrow. "We've built something good here, haven't we?" Delia said softly. "Something very good," Jacob agreed. "A life, a family, a legacy." The mail-order bride who had never been kissed, and the cowboy who had waited patiently for her heart to awaken, had found in each other the greatest treasure of the frontier, not gold or land, but love that had the strength to endure and the wisdom to grow with each passing season. And as stars appeared one by one in the vast Colorado sky, Delia and Jacob Russell sat hand in hand, secure in the knowledge that the journey they had begun as strangers had led them to the most profound companionship. Either could have imagined a love story written not in grand gestures, but in the patient, daily acts of care and understanding that had transformed a business arrangement into a bond that would last a lifetime.